Hey guys, glad to see such a full crowd here for us.
Yeah, awesome.
And
It's a lot of pressure.
yeah, and we're mainly going to be talking about Barack Obama, America's two-term president, who still has a lot of political currency and cultural currency, certainly. But I thought I'd begin by telling me, you know, I recall I was in Chicago this year, and suddenly everybody was talking about Shirley Chisholm and her run for president. And then in the wings, there was Jesse Jackson in a wheelchair in Chicago, his town. How important is Jesse Jackson in the history, in the trajectory that becomes the Barack Obama in the White House?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. You know, we think about Obama as a singular figure for good reason. You know, arguably no one else could have done in 2008 what he did, or in any political cycle prior to that, or you know, thus far subsequent to it. But that has tended to overshadow the antecedents in some fundamental ways. One of which was Shirley Chisholm, and you know, who was more closely connected to Kamala Harris's run than, and also I think Kamala Harris deliberately cultivated that kind of connection. But the other was Jesse Jackson, who had this very complicated, sometimes antagonistic relationship with Barack Obama, but unquestionably paved the way for Barack Obama to be elected. And this is in a kind of broad figurative sense, or kind of symbolic sense, but also in a very real, structural, practical way. So symbolically, you know, the 84 and 88 Jesse Jackson campaigns, you know, kind of begin this grassroots, multiracial populist movement, which, you know, has clear kind of flourishes in, interestingly enough, what eventually becomes the Bernie Sanders movement. And so the kind of origins of the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson talks about in those years, what first bring him in touch with Bernie Sanders, who eventually kind of like becomes the most visible incarnation of that kind of idea of grassroots politics. In 1988, Jesse Jackson runs. He famously wins Iowa and I think Vermont. And so he wins 2 states, 2 primaries. People are shocked. No one has ever seen an African-American candidate win before. Moreover, he wins in 2 states that have hardly any black population, which is surprising because before this point, African-Americans get elected to political office in places where there are a significant number of African-American voters. Jesse Jackson broke a barrier pointing to the idea that under certain circumstances, you could win a significant number of white voters as a black candidate. Now, there's an asterisk next to this, which is that Iowa and Vermont both had minuscule black populations. And political scientists know that white voters are more likely to vote for a black candidate. Their likelihood is inversely proportionate to the number of black people who are actually in that state.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
so Jackson fared better in Iowa, long ahead of Obama winning in Iowa, and we'll come back to the kind of significance of that, than he would have if, you know, the first primary had been held in any state where there was a significant black population. If you were talking about Georgia or Virginia or, God forbid, Mississippi or Louisiana.
Do you think the Democratic National Committee has, though, tried to Bigfoot this issue with Representative Claiborne and focusing on South Carolina, no more Iowa, no more New Hampshire, and when, as you point out, Jackson can win in Iowa, Barack Obama did retail politics well in Iowa and came out fine. Should the Democratic Party go back to Howard Dean's 50 states and say, we're running Iowa?
So here's the thing. Not only did Obama do well in Iowa, he needed Iowa in order to win in South Carolina, which is something that people have overlooked over the course of the years. So there was the other part of this in terms of political behavior is that African American voters have generally looked askance at African American presidential candidates. When you go back through the record of them, very few of them received substantial support, Jesse Jackson being the anomaly in this case, right? Barack Obama elicited a certain amount of interest among black voters who were the majority in the Democratic primary in South Carolina, which he really needed to win. But it was kind of basic curiosity. There wasn't a kind of groundswell of interest in him. And as a matter of fact, a friend of mine from college worked on the Obama campaign in South Carolina. And he said, we were going out and canvassing. We were telling people that there was this candidate who was running as a black candidate named Barack Obama, and people didn't know. They had heard his name, but they didn't know he was black. And so then they started putting his picture on all the campaign materials. And they were like, oh, well, who is this guy? And what kind of name is Barack Obama? And then he was like, oh, put his family on, So some of those early campaign photos, some of the more notable ones, were meant to introduce him to black voters in South Carolina, who were still generally skeptical of him until he won in Iowa, which established that he actually was a viable candidate. And so black voters then took him seriously in South Carolina in a way that they never would have if South Carolina had been the first primary.
And Jesse Jackson was originally from South Carolina. And when he's there as Barack Obama, do you think do we account for the changing of the name in the Black Power movement, or the fact Muhammad Ali?
Right.
Do you think the name Barack, if he ran in South Carolina or the black community as Barry, would have made a difference than being Barack?
No, I think there was something to be said that he embraced his full name, and I think he talked about that and saying he embraced his identity and he kind of recognized. That said, there was a lot of explaining that had to be done. In 2007 in Selma, where people went historically each year to recognize the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, in advance of the movement to push for a national Voting Rights Act, Barack Obama spoke, that Sunday in 2007, and he translated what his grandfather's experience had been like in Kenya under colonialism in comparison to what people's experiences had been like in Alabama. He had to explain, this thing where people don't call you by your first name, but they just call you boy. Yeah, my grandfather experienced that in Kenya. This thing where all the kind of ritual humiliations or kind of daily elements of disrespect that people have to weather, he's making the case that he understands this too, because people don't necessarily know that he's part of that community in that way. But I do want to add one thing, though, one thing that I didn't say. I said symbolically Jesse was important. Structurally, the thing that Jesse Jackson did that was really important was that in 1988, when they won 7 million votes and they came into the Democratic convention with all of these backers, and then you sit down and say, what do you want? Jesse Jackson and one of his chief campaign advisors, a man by the name of Ron Walters, said that they wanted a proportionate electoral voting system. And that was the point at which the Democratic Party switched to that system that said, okay, we will tally up this number, you get this number, as opposed to the winner take all. I interviewed Ron Walters about this, who actually also happened to be my college political science professor. Years later, I interviewed him about this. And I said, did you know, and that you remember back to 2008, that proportional system is what allowed Barack Obama to beat Hillary Clinton in the primaries. Yeah. And so I said, did you know that system would allow a black candidate, or facilitate a black candidate getting the nomination? And he said, no. He said, we knew that it would maximize the influence that African-American voters had in the kind of primaries, but we never even imagined that this would lead to a black person getting the nomination.
You know, I have memory, all of you do too, I'm sure, when Barack Obama gave his great victory speech in 2008 in Grant Park. Grant Park, Chicago, 1968 was where the mayhem took place. Tear gas, Chicago police, SDS, Black Panthers, Dick Gregory, you know, the whole bit going on there. And the Pope had come, Pope John Paul II had come to kind of heal Grant Park. But then Obama's victory speech there in front of 250,000 people, not one arrest in Chicago, was a love fest. And there, the most memorable visual I have a few, but I think the most memorable is Jesse Jackson crying.
Right.
And yet Jackson was not in sync with Obama. I mean, they had a lot of bad energy between them. You speak to that if you could.
Yeah, they did. I mean, at the end of the day, these were still, fairly, highly self-regarding individuals who. Did I say that delicately enough?
This is why he's the dean of Columbia.
Yeah, I described an experience the other day. I was talking to David Remnick, and he inquired about how this thing had gone, and I said, I didn't leave brimming with new knowledge. And so he said, the subtlety is really good, Jelani. You're doing well with that. And so, but I think some of this was kind of the personalities. The other part of it was that Jesse Jackson strongly felt that he had been forgotten, that they had done these things that made this black presidency possible. And one consequence of it was that he had become like yesterday's newspaper. You know, like people didn't see the connection between what he had done in this kind of moment. And then, all the things that happened after, inauguration.
And you just mentioned David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, and he wrote the book The Bridge, which was really linking John Lewis to Obama, and that's what Obama wanted, to be linked to John Lewis, and that puts Jackson in a different category, and Andy Young or others, and it became the Obama-Lewis pipeline.
Yeah.
Did the media world buy in? I saw when Jimmy Carter, nobody knew him when he ran for president in '76, and he did a little book, Why Not the Best? Nobody would publish it. A one-term governor from Georgia, a Christian press called Broadman out of Nashville published it, sold a million copies of Why Not the Best. Was Obama able to control his narrative and story because of that he was a writer, like New Yorker writers are, and that he fell in with the John Lewis side of it, and he was able to build Michelle and the South Side in her. Was he able to frame his own narrative in a way that you find unusual in any way?
Yeah, I think, first off, there's a confluence of events, and it's this kind of moment that we see, which is hard for us to grasp in 2024, that there is this kind of possibility that he's a person who represents, at least to some people, a new beginning, that there is this earnest desire for racial reconciliation in the country, and people, think that he is part of that equation. And given all the antagonism and all the polarization and all the hostility and the kind of fraught nature of these things now, it almost seems like the kind of stereotypical, more innocent time. But certainly his ability to kind of navigate that moment was contingent upon all of these tools that he had. He's incredibly well-spoken, he's tall, handsome, has a beautiful family, and is just a flat-out phenomenal writer. One of the things I think was a dynamic in the way that the press treated Obama or reacted to Obama, at least it's like a kind of armchair psychological theory of mine, is that we often interact with people whom we know are not as adept at communication as we are, because that's not what they do, even if they're kind of public figures or whatever. But their job is not to communicate in a written word in a way that we would. Right. But Obama very often elicited this dynamic where people felt they were interacting with a peer, someone who was a fellow crafter of words, and someone who was like a kind of paid really meticulous attention to language in those kinds of ways. And it's uncommon. It's highly unusual for us to have a president that has that particular
And to
skill set.
be the head of Harvard Law Review,
Right.
which I mean, but looking at the young Barack Obama, I mean, I'm always taking that the fact that his mother was only 18 years old when she had him. I mean, that's a young mom that he had, and then that being in Hawaii, and I guess all that taught him in a different way of multicultural living.
Right.
But it does.
But only Hawaii being the only state where people of color are the majority.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a huge boost of confidence. And yes, and I do think being at Columbia University in New York was big. I mean, for him, for he started reading. And who do you see as the since we're at a book festival, Obama's reading? I always am impressed. I've had a talk with him about Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which shocked me because I didn't think that was right up his wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But it is. He knew all about the Ginsberg
really
and Corso and all. But it was more Visible Man, Ralph Ellison, and some philosophy, Camus.
Well, Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr was like, big for him.
Do you know much about that, about Niebuhr? Why Niebuhr? I know Carter used to say he loved Niebuhr. I mean, well, first of all, Niebuhr grew up, I think, in Illinois and along Route 66, and I forget it might be Lincoln, Illinois, I think, Niebuhr. But then Jimmy Carter used to constantly quote Niebuhr saying, "The sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world." And how does a young guy like Obama get into Niebuhr at Columbia, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know, other than I think that, as part of this general quest that you see of Obama in that time frame, he credits the time at Columbia with, being the period where he really gets serious about, himself and like, I have opportunities in front of me and so on, and that, maybe comes out of that moment. But I think it's interesting that Niebuhr, in his understanding of American politics and American theology, kind of emphasizes restraint and the possibility, kind of humility, and the idea of unintended consequences, of being able to do one thing that really winds up, rather than simplifying your situation, vastly complicates it. And I think there's a direct translation to how people understood Obama as a political actor. Although people thought he was cautious, there were some things about him that were really frustrating, and I think that was partly, due to the way that he understood the world in that way. Of course, we have the exact opposite dynamic of that now, which is that a kind of heedless, reckless, do things, what are consequences? Consequences, what are those things? Kind of idea, and that's why I think, in this strange way, Obama and Trump have been twinned, in history. If you give me 30 seconds, I'll actually explain what I mean by that.
Go.
So here's an interesting dynamic. Obama is a product of Hawaii, which is the only state that has a majority people of color population. But it is this kind of multicultural, polyglot, environment of people from all over the place, and it produces him. As a matter of fact, I had a conversation with an Asian American friend of mine like years ago about Obama, and we were saying that he was like this encapsulation of like black cool. And he was like, no, that is Asian cool. That came from Honolulu.
Yeah.
And so I was like, that might, they have a point, actually. And so there's that. And that produces Obama. He comes out of that world.
And he had white prep school kids, so he
White
knew
prep
how to
school
navigate
kids. He had
that.
the experience of his grandparents. He understood the world in this very complicated way. And he wasn't kind of a partisan in one community that is then interacting with other kinds of people. Donald Trump represents, in a weird way, that same sort of experience, because Trump is from Queens, which is where I'm also from. Queens is currently the statistically most diverse county in the United States. Over 400 languages spoken there. When Donald Trump grew up in Queens, it was the second whitest part of New York City. And so he and I are about a generation apart. My version of Queens, when I played high school baseball, I was a right fielder. The left fielder was South Asian, his family is Sikh. The center fielder was, I think his family was from Venezuela. The catcher was Jamaican. First baseman was Jewish. We had this entire United Nations on the baseball field. But Trump's version of Queens had been almost entirely white. And what accounts for that rapid turnover in a generation is the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which transformed the face of American demography, but it started that transformation in Queens. Queens diversified even more quickly than the rest of New York City until it became the most diverse part of the most diverse city in the country. The significance of this is that while Obama grew up in this world in which difference was embraced, Trump represented this generation, which was kind of encapsulated by the character Archie Bunker, that show was set in Queens. Yeah. For people in the 1970s who had just begun to see how rapidly their communities were changing, and they had an allergic reaction to it. So Obama and Trump represented these feuding responses to the diversification of American society.
Very nicely. Isn't that great? I love that. Now, but you sound very much proud of Queens, and of course Louis Armstrong's home's there.
That's right.
Toured. Are you going to work to save the Trump home in Queens? Should it be a National Historic Site?
Well, it's historic, certainly. On the National kind of Historic Register, it should be. But there's a whole kind of history of that community that Trump comes from, too. And so,
we were mentioning earlier, his father was at the Klan rally.
That's right.
And got arrested. I don't know how you get arrested watching a Klan rally. He managed to do it.
I don't know. Yeah, that's terrible police
oversight. I know. Let's just shift into the Obama as a grassroots organizer. Barack Obama comes to Chicago, and interestingly, they're built, and it'll open in next spring, actually, 2025, the Obama Center, right there by University of Chicago. So you should all visit it. And then there's another site there called the Kissing Rock, where Barack Obama invited Michelle for their first date. And he invited her to a Baskin-Robbins because in Hawaii, his brief time working, he was scooping. He said how sore my wrist would get from doing the scooping of ice cream, but he knew all the flavors, Rocky Road, and So he took her to the Baskin-Robbins there, and they sat and they had their kiss on this rock. And some local people have made it into a memorial in Chicago. Yeah, it's like a kitschy thing. Yeah, it's funny. It's weird.
That's kind of doing a lot.
Yeah, I know. But the point is that it was a big part of his life because it's not just meeting her, dating her, marrying her, and having two lovely children with her, but they became quite a team. And she represents real, as her memoir brilliantly, I think, first chapters pulls out that she was real Chicago.
That's right.
Black community, South Side, and all that entails. And he's like an interloper with an extraordinary Chicago narrative. So what does Michelle Robinson introduce into Barack Obama's life when they meet in Chicago?
So there are a few things. Like first, if we're going back on that Jesse Jackson point, which is that one of Michelle's oldest childhood friends is one of Jesse Jackson's daughters. And so she knew that family for years, long before, she met, Barack. The other thing about her is that I think for him, he was this almost exotic figure. Certainly he was an exotic figure in American life, broadly speaking. The mere idea of a viable black presidential candidate was exotic and unusual, much less the half Kenyan, half Kansan, Honolulu to Indonesia. The kind of trajectory of his life is highly atypical for a presidential candidate. But Michelle Robinson was legible to people. She was someone that people understood. And he was at least as exotic to black voters as he was to white ones. And so she explained him in some particular ways. For people going like, I don't know this guy, he's kind of unusual and different, but she was very legible. We all went to school with someone like her, or we knew someone growing up in our community, and so she was the kind of black girl next door, the black version of the girl next door. And so that, I think, was incalculably valuable to him. Also the fact that he married this woman who was undeniably black.
Yeah.
There wasn't any question about her. She was a dark brown complexioned woman. It wasn't that, he was trying to find someone where you would have to look sideways and go, is she, she was this person who was clearly identifiably black, which people took to be a statement. Whether that was meant to be a statement or whatever, like people fall in love with who they fall in love with, but people certainly read into that a statement that he wasn't trying to run away from his black identity.
And he had dated white women when he
Right.
was younger, and he.
But you also recall that the woman who broke up with him said, "There's a wonderful black woman." White woman broke up with him and said, "There's a wonderful black woman out there somewhere that you're supposed to marry," which is hilarious. And after it, but in the moment, that really has to suck.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Someone's like, yeah. I think you need to go find a sister. I don't. Well, if I can just for a moment detour. I went on a date once to church with a woman that I was very interested in at once. And then I went to service, and then after the service, we're walking, and she says, "I feel like God doesn't want this to happen."
My God, man.
And it was like a real paradox.
Yeah.
Because I was like, do I go emotional? Do I go theological? What is the apt response? So I think about Barack Obama.
How did you respond to that?
The only way you can respond to that with any shred of dignity is I understand, that's fine. Hopefully we can be friends.
Yeah.
But I think Barack Obama in that moment, the person saying that there is this black woman out there somewhere, which he actually proved to be right. History tends to iron out those kinds of wrinkles.
Well, in Chicago, where that Hyde Park area, and struck me in Chicago, South Side. Sometimes people lump it, but Hyde Park, you go where the Obama's house is, and it's across from a synagogue. But on the same, a block down is Farrakhan's house.
That's right.
Really, right? The same block. And there's Muhammad Ali used to live here.
Yeah.
And then Jesse Jackson's Operation Push is just right around the corner from there. It's a different universe. And then you go down to Bronzeville neighborhood there, and it used to be the great aristocratic kind of, but that's because during the Great Migration, that was where the train let you off, and it was a deeply segregated Chicago. Mm-hmm. But that part of that Bronzeville that Obama connects his music here, that one little area there within a few blocks, where the home growing up of Lou Rawls, Herbie Hancock, Sam Cooke, Nat King Cole, Gwendolyn Brooks, Emmett Till's mother, the church there, which now is a national site. Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon and and Buddy Guy. The whole bit. Obama seems to get into that music of black music, which I can't imagine. He was a rock and roll kid, Rolling Stone magazine in Hawaii, but he does immerse himself into those kind of sounds. And you were at a White House music. What year was that?
That was that was at the end.
End of administration, where he's celebrating. Yeah. How do you reflect on, now we look at his Spotify list or whatever, and what he's listening to, and he weighs in on Drake or Kendrick Lamar, and but I think there's, would you tell me about the music tradition in Obama and Chicago and what you witnessed there on that
Oh yeah, that was
evening?
a really interesting evening. And so I was there, and this was like one of the kind of final things. It was a celebration of Black music, and so it was very strange because like my wife and I got invited to this, and like I was kind of like, I don't know how I got invited to this, but I'm gonna go. And then we're like at a table, and like Dave Chappelle and Usher are there, and I'm like, it's like very odd, you know. And then, you know, like they're like rapping, and these are not like the clean radio edits of very songs. And I was like, this is very strange to hear this song in the White House. And like there's like this Black president who's here, and they're all kind of like all this stuff happening at once. And also I think my wife was like 8 months pregnant at the time. And so it was just like a lot in that moment. But it also, to me, kind of marked the end of like that point. Like what Donald Trump represented was something very different, and a kind of revanchist movement, you know, for everything to oppose everything that Obama had represented. I also want to talk about some of him, you know, in the White House. You know, if we can, you know.
Is there any music you think, when you think Barack Obama, do you think of Stevie Wonder, or do you think of Bruce Springsteen, or?
No, I think about Stevie Wonder.
Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, I never got what the Bruce Springsteen thing was. I mean, I think they have like a friendship or whatever, but nobody really connected him with Bruce Springsteen's music.
And you know that song, Sweet Home Chicago, that was an old Robert Johnson blues song that went through odd reiterations, and then became like a theme song in the White House from the desolate Robert Johnson bluesman into being the theme of the White House. I mean, can you imagine if Robert Johnson, you know, could have dreamed that such a thing could happen?
That would have been a very strange dream. For Robert Johnson, no less.
Yeah.
But I do want to say one thing about Obama in terms of like him in the White House, which is that, weirdly enough, all of that we just talked about, the highly, highly idiosyncratic moment that allowed him to ascend to the highest level in American politics, in some ways, I think, worked against him in the White House. Because I think that he consistently believed that there was always a way forward. There was always a deal to be made. There was always a way. Because he had already surpassed so many obstacles, had navigated, you know, around so many barriers, that when, you know, he thinks that he can get Republicans on board for the ACA, it really is like a dash of cold water, you know, to hear there is no deal. There is nothing that you can do. Even if you give us kind of policies that have been, you know, talking points of Republicans on health care across the country, we still will not support this. But this is about you. Or the kind of cold water of Mitch McConnell saying the objective is for him to be a one-term president. Or pivoting where he loosens up restrictions on offshore drilling in the Gulf of Gulf of America, in hopes that will create enough space for Republicans to pivot on climate, and that he'll get something on a climate bill, and he gets nothing. That happened, guns, like again and again and again, there's a kind of perennial optimism that can't be disconnected from the fact that he is the first Black person to ever achieve this office, and that optimism proves to actually be a liability in some cases.
He used to have myself and Robert Caro and a couple of historians to meet in the White House, and climate was a big issue for me, and he was desperate. He kept saying, how do you do a visual of something like, well, you just can show disasters, but you can't 100% say it's a climate disaster emergency. But the end result was his trip. You could look the photos up of going to Alaska, like holding a fish with the glacier and all. He was trying to visualize it. And on guns, he tried, the Newtown so devastated him. Not kidding. I mean, broke his heart. And he did 110% for gun control reform. And he said, look, it's not going to happen because guns in Kentucky are cultural. And Mike Bloomberg talked about them. And, Mike Bloomberg could say that in New York, but you get on the ground in those places, you're not going to be able to do it. And you're right, he kind of got flummoxed on things like guns and climate, not for lack of trying, and he always wanted Boehner from Ohio back, because even though Boehner drank, he said I could golf with him and get a deal, but he wasn't going to get no deal out of Mitch McConnell.
But even look at what happened with him. Like, he wound up being the odd man out in his own caucus, because they had just reached the moment at which the old horse trading order had expired. And I think that after all of that kind of all the transcending that it took to get to that position, it's a kind of bitter irony that, this identity is so strongly connected. And at this point, it's not simply him being a black president, but that certainly increases the antagonism. And one of the kind of stark moments where I saw this was that I covered Charleston and the murder of 9 people at Emanuel AME in 2015. And Dylan Roof said explicitly that he had killed the people in that church because he felt that black people were taking over the world. And that had been a response to the fact that for the preceding 7 years, there had been an African American in the White House. And that kind of level, from the level of what's happening in the political arena to what's happening socially in the kind of politics of backlash.
And again, with the music, we live in a world of sound bites, and Obama does not have a great voice. But he has spirit, and when he doesn't, he started singing Amazing Grace.
That's right.
And then people stopped, then people leaned into it to help him.
Were you there?
Deeply touching moment. I unfortunately covered that on the screen, but not there.
Yeah, I was in the room, and it was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. Because if you recall, he stops in his tracks, and it's just this interminable silence. I think it's like 45 seconds, which feels like 4 hours. And then he starts in this kind of like faltering voice with Amazing Grace. Now, of course, he has spent enough time in black churches that he knows, like, if I start this, they're going to come in, behind me. Everybody knows their part here. But, the selection of that particular song and what that song says, and the cultural kind of history of that song, and also implicitly saying that this is something that's beyond politics. I am not talking about policy now. Right. I am talking about the spirit of this nation, which is why I'm using song, not policy, not this. Like, we have a sickness that has to be addressed on a spiritual level. And it was an incredibly profound thing to see a president do. Very profound. And actually, when we were talking about it, I saw a couple people in the audience going like it struck memory bells, So on our remaining time, let's talk about his presidency and treat him as he would want to be treated as a president, because he wanted to be a good president, a very good one. He wasn't aiming for Mount Rushmore. He just wanted to be good. Let's look at the two-termer, so that goes for his favor, beating Romney the second time. And the passing of the Affordable Care Act out of it. Well, he inherited a Great Recession, right? Pulls America out of that, deals with the financial crisis, saves General Motors, but pushes hard on that Affordable Care Act, and it triggers a Tea Party movement and the rest. However, by winning a second term and his fighting for it, it does seem to be, but who knows in this environment, a signature achievement and maybe a birthright of people. It's kind of been baked in like Social Security or Medicaid, Medicare. Reflect on the Affordable Care Act. How important do you think that is to Obama's presidency from a historical point of view? It's funny because we've referred to it as the Affordable Care Act here, right? But we don't, when people were stigmatizing it as Obamacare, they meant that pejoratively. And my thinking, I always thought about that in a different light. I was like, most people don't associate Medicare or Medicaid with LBJ. It's just Medicare, Medicaid. And I said, what I think will happen is that this will become institutionalized. And rather than it being a kind of nameless, faceless policy that people presume we've always had, what people have done is that they have branded it. So we will always know to associate it with Barack Obama. Like at some point, Obamacare will not be the pejorative you intended it to be, but it will actually be a superlative. It will be a compliment. Like, yeah, Obamacare. Like this was a point where we actually made a difference in healthcare policy. And so, of course, there are like lots of kind of things that we could criticize about kind of the current healthcare landscape. But still, by and large, I think that has held up. That people know that the biggest intervention that we have had in leveling the field for Americans with any kind of health concern whatsoever happened under the presidency of Barack Obama.
Exactly, and he got really interested in Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, universal health care, and so he gave a Obamacare speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, at the exact spot TR had taught, meaning that he's trying to say, I'm not a social, this is Theodore Roosevelt was saying what I'm saying right now. But everybody tried to do that, but he got it done, and he paid a cost for it.
Sure.
But I think that lives on. How important do you think for the killing of Osama bin Laden, Operation Neptune Spear? Here's the guy George W. Bush couldn't get.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about Obama was that people presumed him to be kind of nicer than he actually was. And I mean that like in a positive sense. Like when he was running, so in South Carolina, I was in South Carolina, I was writing about South Carolina, and I saw someone with a sign that said, if you want to catch Osama, you have to vote Obama. And I remember seeing this and being like, these people have really lost it with the enthusiasm. Because I was like, nothing about this guy suggests that he's going to do like what the United States government has not been able to do. And then I remember I was at a friend's house hanging out, like I think it was a Sunday, and we were just hanging out, spending time together. It was a group of us, and I was leaving, heading home, and then everyone ran out of the house and was like, come back inside. I was like, what happened? I was like, they just killed Osama bin Laden. I was like, what? I was completely wrong about this, but the fact of it was that he had the temerity to do what a lot of people would not have done in that position, which was violate the sovereign airspace of a putative American ally in order to go get, I see Lawrence Wright in the audience. He can talk about this much better than I can. But the mission to go get, Osama bin Laden, which required a degree of temerity that I don't think his critics or even some of his supporters would have attributed to him before that.
And, Admiral McRaven comes usually, he's often here at the festival, and they've become close friends, Obama and McRaven, from the experience. But that story, which I'm going to botch it a little bit, and I'm condensing it for time. But when they got them and they got Osama bin Laden, and McRaven had to talk to them in the Situation Room, all of them, the famous photo of, and Obama said, "Are you sure it's him?" And it kind of startled McRaven, and he looked, and he said, "Yeah, it's his 6'4".
Yeah, I was like, "Yeah, it's not that many dudes.
Not that many dudes that look like him." But still, you're wondering, well, what if? And so he said, "Hold on, Mr. President." And McRaven went and found a measuring, one of those, and he pulled it to measure it, and then he said, "Yes, it is. I got the measuring. I'm sorry, I had to go get the measuring stick." He said, "We're spending $1 trillion." On all this military, and it ends up where I'm going out, my face hanging public on a ruler that you've got.
I mean, you don't want him to come back with like, shit, it's his younger brother.
Oh man, yeah, exactly. What about look, Donald Trump? Whatever you feel about him, his first term, he got 3 people into the Supreme Court.
Right.
Obama got 2.
Yeah.
And
then let's not forget the intervention of Mitch McConnell there too.
It would have been 3. That's a very that's a whole other hour. But Sotomayor and Kagan, how do you think that looks in hindsight, picking those 2 women, which was bold in a way, coming at life from different perspectives, but any reflections on them on the court?
Mainly that I think that those are the 2 women whose health is most fervently prayed over in the United States at any given point. But yeah, I mean, I think that's we've seen all of those kind of dissenting decisions that have come from the court as this engineered supermajority has taken root in the intervening years. And of course, you can't know these things in the moment, but, you know.
And LGBTQ rights in that era, and now look at what's going on
Sure.
on that, meaning same-sex marriage.
Right.
In the Obama years. What does it say about Obama? Last question, and we're out of time. But he was always seems to me to want to he'd rather have things up, like signing national monuments. He saved Cesar Chavez here in California National Monument, and Stonewall in New York for LGBTQ, or Buffalo Soldiers, and and Harriet Tubman, and Bears Ears for tribal management, and many examples like that. Building up, opening the narrative of American history for inclusion more than ripping down statues of the past. Is Obama right to look at it? Is that the way to do it? Do we start talking more about people like Ruby Bridges and put up statues of Dolores Huerta or whatever, as a way of history as an affirmative more than reparations and take down Confederate statues?
I think Obama represented the best of that idea, that he believed that you could be additive, that you didn't have to subtract anything, and that he consistently tried to make the case that he wasn't trying to take anything away. If I can add a 10-second version of my perspective, is that we never should have taken down the Confederate memorials. We should have toppled them and left them on their sides like defeated chess pieces.
And we're gonna end with that perfect quote. And thank you all. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you.